The grand hall of the government building gleamed under fluorescent lights. An old man in a faded grey janitor uniform slowly pushed his trash cart down the corridor. Every step he took came with a heavy, dragging sound. He spoke to no one, made eye contact with no one. Young office workers passed by without a glance. A group near the elevator chuckled quietly, pointing at his back. To them, he was just a hunched old man with a limp, out of place in a fast-paced world. A background character, someone to ignore. But what they didn't see was what one young soldier was about to notice. On the man's left chest pocket, barely visible beneath the folds of his worn-out shirt, was an old ribbon. Small, frayed at the edges, almost forgotten. Yet carrying the weight of courage, of battlefields, of a man once called a hero by his unit. Just one look at the right moment, and the truth began to reveal itself. His name was Walter Greene, 78 years old, with hair as white as ash and eyes faded by time. He had worked as a janitor in that government building for 14 years. In all that time, he had never missed a single day. Not for rain, not for snow, not even for illness. He always showed up on time, cleaned every floor with quiet dedication, never asked for praise, never expected thanks. Walter wasn't a man of many words. He moved through the hallways like a shadow, polite but distant, as if he carried a whole world inside him that no one else could enter. His shoulders were stooped, as though he bore the weight of a long life on his back. His left leg dragged with every step, creating a soft scraping sound against the cold tile floors. That sound, steady and faint, was the only sign he was there. The young people in the building knew who he was, but they never really saw him. They called him the old floor guy and often looked past him. Some even grew annoyed when he mopped too close to their desks or left a damp patch on the floor. Not because he did anything wrong, just because he didn't fit in. He was the old world in a building full of sleek screens, espresso cups, and endless meetings. At lunch, Walter always sat in the same quiet corner by the emergency stairwell on the 5th floor. The light from the narrow window above spilled just enough to brighten his small spot. He would open a scratched-up metal lunchbox and turn on his old wooden radio, the one he'd had for years. It only picked up one clear station, classic. Country music, the soft twang of a steel guitar filled the hallway. Out of place among the buzzing smartphones and Bluetooth earbuds, he ate slowly, spooning cold rice and meat from a neatly packed container. He never complained, never rushed. He carried a cloth napkin, wiped his mouth after every meal, then folded it carefully and laid it across his knee. To most, he was barely visible, like a faded photograph tucked away in a drawer. But when that old John Denver song played from his radio, "Taking Me Home Country Roads," he seemed to drift, just for a moment, into another time. Occasionally, young employees would walk by. They didn't greet him. A few whispered to each other, stifling laughs if he accidentally dropped his mop or knocked over his bucket. One day, someone even joked aloud, "Bet he falls asleep while sweeping," and the others laughed. Walter didn't react. He simply picked up the mop and carried on, head down. He was used to it, but there was one thing they didn't see. Tucked beneath the cloth napkin on his lap, inside the chest pocket of his uniform, was something small and worn, an old ribbon. Its colors had faded, its edges frayed, but anyone who had served would recognize it instantly. It was a bronze star, a decoration awarded for heroic service in combat. He never showed it off, never mentioned it. It wasn't for display. It was a reminder of the men who never came home, and of the part of himself he left on the battlefield so many years ago. The limp in his leg wasn't from age, it came from shrapnel, lodged deep during the siege of Kisan, 1968. But no one ever asked, and Walter never offered. The world around him had moved on, and so Walter lived each day the same way. Quietly, humbly, with his memories folded neatly behind his silence. In a place where no one remembered what he once gave for a country that now walked past him without a glance. The third floor of the government building was always the busiest. The IT department sat at the far end of the hallway, filled with young professionals typing away on sleek keyboards, screens flickering, coffee cups steaming beside their laptops. They lived in a world of code, speed, and urgency, and amidst the steady flow of movement up and down the corridor, there was always one slow figure, Walter Greene, with his old mop and the steady drag of his left foot echoing softly on the tile floor. It was a Wednesday, just before noon. Walter was sweeping the hallway, bending over carefully to pick up a few paper scraps near the conference room. His back ached with every motion, but he didn't complain. It was part of the job. On his cart were cleaning supplies, a plastic trash bin, a half-empty bottle of glass cleaner, and a stack of worn-out towels that had lost all color. The overhead AC blew a gentle breeze, making the yellow caution sign sway faintly near his feet. Two young IT employees exited the office, holding paper coffee cups, chatting loudly as they strolled by. They didn't slow their pace when they passed Walter. One of them, tall, with slicked back hair and a designer watch, glanced at the old man's limp and elbowed his co-worker, snickering. Bet he played football too hard back in the day. Busted that leg good, huh? He said, chuckling. The other one, shorter and wearing glasses, laughed along. Nah, I think he's been at war with the restroom dust bunnies for too long. Their laughter echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the polished walls. The words weren't shouted, but they were loud enough. Walter heard them. He always did, but he didn't turn around, didn't flinch, didn't even sigh. He simply bent lower and kept sweeping, eyes fixed on the floor. He had heard jokes like that before. Over the years, he'd heard plenty, some whispered, some said out loud. He never responded, never corrected them. Silence had become his armor, and he wore it well. But today, something was different. Someone else had witnessed the exchange. Standing at the far end of the hall, near the elevators, was a young man in uniform. He was sharp in appearance, green Marine Corps shirt tucked neatly into pressed khaki trousers, shoes polished too. A mirror shine. His posture was rigid, composed. His name was Brandon Carter, a lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, recently returned from Camp Pendleton for an assignment with the city's military affairs office. Brandon hadn't meant to get involved. He was just waiting for the elevator, minding his own business. But when he heard the laughter and saw the way the old janitor absorbed the insult with quiet dignity, something inside him stirred. It wasn't the insult itself. It was the man's eyes. There was a look in them that Brandon recognized. He had seen it before, in war, in grief, in memory. As the young workers disappeared around the corner, Brandon stepped slowly forward. He didn't speak at first. He simply observed. He watched how Walter bent over with care, how he used a towel, not the mop, to polish a scuff mark on the floor. Every movement was deliberate, practiced, disciplined. Then he noticed something else, something small, almost invisible to anyone else, tucked just barely into the left chest pocket. Of Walter's uniform was a ribbon, frayed at the edges, Its colors faded, but Brandon recognized it instantly. The Bronze Star medal. His breath caught. A Bronze Star wasn't given for showing up. It wasn't something you earned behind a desk or in a supply room. It was awarded for acts of bravery, extraordinary heroism on the battlefield. And it wasn't given out lightly. Brandon took a few steps closer, his eyes locked on the ribbon. The old man glanced up, sensing his approach, and the two made eye contact. The younger man saw more than age in those eyes. He saw history, standing. At attention, Brandon raised his right hand in a formal military salute. Straight-backed, palm down, eyes steady. "Sir," he said, his voice strong but respectful. "Was it Kisan?" 1968. Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he gave a small, measured nod. "I was there," he said quietly. "1st Battalion, 9th Marines." Brandon lowered his hand, heart heavy with recognition. "Sergeant," he said, "I'm Lieutenant Brandon Carter. I served at Pendleton. I just want to say thank you. And I'm sorry for what I just heard back there." Walter nodded once more. His lips pressed into a thin line, but his eyes softened, not in pride, but in understanding. He didn't need the apology, but he appreciated it. It wasn't the first time he'd been mocked, but it might have been the first time in a long while someone had looked at him and seen more than a janitor. Further down the hallway, the two IT workers paused, puzzled by the scene. They had no idea why a Marine lieutenant would be standing at attention in front of the old janitor. But something in the young man's posture made them hesitate, even back away. Walter said nothing more. He turned and continued sweeping, but something about the way he carried himself changed. Maybe it was just a little straighter, a little stronger. Brandon stood in silence for another few seconds, then turned and walked toward the stairwell, his chest full of quiet admiration. It wasn't for the medal. It was for the man who had carried it, unspoken, uncelebrated, for decades, that day. Walter Greene, the quiet janitor with the old ribbon, became more than a forgotten face. Not through his own words, but through the silent salute of a soldier who understood exactly what that ribbon meant. And as words slowly spread through the building, through whispers, glances, and questions, something shifted. Not because Walter demanded respect, but because, for the first time, someone had truly seen him. Brandon Carter was walking down the third-floor hallway, his steps steady, his eyes glancing across office doors as he passed. It was just another day, busy, full of ringing phones and fast conversations. He had no intention of stopping, but then, just as he was about to turn toward the elevator, something caught his eye. The old janitor was bending over to pick up a piece of paper near the wall. And in that moment, something slipped from his chest pocket, just slightly visible, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. A ribbon, worn and crumpled, peeked out from the folds of his faded uniform. 3 colors, reddish-brown, gold, and olive green, faded by time, frayed at the edges. But Brandon knew exactly what it was. His heart tightened. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the ribbon. There was no mistake. The Bronze Star Medal, one of the most prestigious military honors the United States can bestow. It isn't given lightly, not for paperwork, not for showing up. It's awarded for heroic service in combat, for valor under fire. Brandon couldn't stay silent. He called out, his voice clear and steady, echoing through the hallway. "Sir, is that a Bronze Star?" The entire hallway went still. The tapping keyboards, the footsteps, the idle chatter, all fell into a sudden silence. Heads turned. Young office workers froze in place, looking first at Brandon, then at the old man with the mop. Walter Greene slowly lifted his head. His eyes met the young Marine's, calm, steady. He reached up and gently tapped the worn patch on his chest. "I was awarded it at Kisan," he said quietly. 1968. The air felt frozen. Without hesitation, Brandon stood at attention. In front of everyone, the co-workers, the managers, the passers-by, he raised his hand in a sharp military salute, a gesture of respect, not for status, but for sacrifice. He held it firmly, proudly, then stepped forward and spoke, his voice full of purpose. "Thank you, sir, for what you did for this country. I'm a Marine too, but I'm just getting started. You're a legend." Walter said nothing at first, but something in his expression shifted. Not pride, not surprise, but something deeper. As if a piece of his past, long buried and forgotten, had finally been seen. Not for glory, but for truth. For a few moments, no one moved. The hallway remained silent, and then, slowly, people began to stir. They didn't speak. They didn't laugh. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stood still, unsure of what to say. The young workers who had once whispered and joked now stared with wide eyes, no longer sure what they were seeing or who in that moment. Walter Greene was no longer just the janitor. He didn't need to retell his story. He didn't need applause or medals, just a single ribbon, a single salute. And suddenly, the way people looked at him, at all of it, began to change. Walter Greene still arrived early each morning. He still pushed the same old cleaning cart, still swept the floors with the same quiet care. But now, when he walked down the third-floor hallway, no one passed by without noticing him. The young employees who once looked through him now paused, nodded politely, and said, "Good morning, Sergeant Greene." People began to call him by his proper name, adding a title he had never asked for, but one he had more than earned. Sergeant Walter Greene, U.S. Marine Corps veteran. Some of the younger staff, often a little awkward but sincere, came to apologize for the way they had treated him. Walter didn't scold. He simply nodded, calm and gracious, as he always had been. At lunch, he no longer sat alone in the hallway corner. A few employees, including some who used to avoid him, brought their food and sat with him. They listened quietly as he shared bits and pieces of his story, not graphic war tales, but gentle memories about old comrades, country music, and a pocket watch that had once been buried in the mud, but still ticks to this day. Then one morning, a new portrait appeared on the wall in the building's main lobby, right where everyone passed on their way in. It was a photo of Walter in his janitor uniform, standing with his mop in hand. Below it were just 3 simple words: veteran, hero, humble. Nothing else needed to be said. The story had already been told, not by Walter, but by the way people now saw him. From someone once forgotten, Walter Greene had become a symbol of quiet dignity, not because he had fought in a war, but because he had never stopped living like a soldier, humble, steady, and never asking for recognition. We're often quick to judge others by what we see, but sometimes the old man mopping the floor may be someone who once gave up his youth to protect this country. Final image: Walter sits in the quiet glow of dusk, sipping coffee from a mug, etched with the words Semper. If someone ever sacrificed for your freedom, share this video to honor them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories every week.